My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old. At 1:52 a.m., my world split open in a way I didn't think was survivable. Not because of pain alone, but because of what came after. Because of who didn't come. Because of who chose something else over me. And because of a truth that had been buried for so long it had grown roots through every part of my life without me ever realizing it. It started with a headache. Not the kind you take ibuprofen for and ignore. Not the kind that fades after water and sleep. But something sharp and invasive, like pressure building behind my eyes. Like something inside my skull was expanding and pushing outward. And I remember sitting up in bed at exactly 1:52 a.m., pressing my fingers to my temples, telling myself it was stress, that I'd just worked a double shift at the ER, that my body was tired, that I needed to calm down, breathe, drink water, go back to sleep. By 2:05 a.m., the pain had spread. By 2:12 a.m., I couldn't keep my eyes open because the light hurt much. By 2:17 a.m., I was on the bathroom floor, cold tile against my cheek, my phone clutched in my hand, trying to remember how to dial while my vision blurred at the edges. I called my mother. The first call rang out. The second went to voicemail. The third too. I kept calling. At 2:29 a.m., I left a message, my voice shaking, trying to stay calm because I was a nurse, because I knew what panic did to decision-making, because I'd seen patients spiral when fear took over and I didn't want to be that person, not yet, not when I still believed someone would pick up. Mom, I don't feel right. Please call me back. No answer. At 2:36 a.m., I called again. Voicemail. At 2:41 a.m., I tried my stepfather. Voicemail. Back to my mother. Voicemail. The pain was no longer just pain now. It was something deeper, something wrong in a way my training recognized but my brain didn't want to accept. Something neurological, something dangerous, something that didn't wait politely for morning. By 2:48 a.m., I couldn't stand up. By 2:50 a.m., I started vomiting. By 2:53 a.m., my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice trying to unlock it. I called again, and again, and again. 14 calls, 15, 16, 17. At 3:07 a.m., my phone buzzed. Finally. I thought she was calling back. But it was a text. Emily, stop overreacting. I have an early meeting tomorrow. I can't deal with this right now. Take something and go to sleep. I stared at the screen for a long time, longer than I should have, longer than my body could afford, because something in me needed to understand how those words could exist, how they could be sent after 17 calls in the middle of the night. How someone could read panic between the lines and still choose inconvenience as the bigger problem. Then my vision doubled, and something inside me shifted from confusion to survival. I knew I couldn't wait. I knew I was alone, and I knew that if I didn't move, I might not wake up again. I grabbed my keys with hands that barely worked, dragged myself to my car, and drove. I don't remember most of that drive. I remember red lights that felt like hours. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard, my fingers went numb. I remember telling myself out loud, over and over, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. I pulled into the ER parking lot at 3:29 a.m. I opened the door. I tried to stand, and then everything went black. They told me later it was a hemorrhage, a ruptured aneurysm. 1 minute you're alive and functioning and thinking about your schedule for the next day, and the next minute a blood vessel in your brain gives out, and everything changes in seconds. The surgery lasted 4 hours. They clipped the aneurysm, stopped the bleeding, relieved the pressure. At 7:11 a.m., my heart rate crashed. At 7:12, I coded. 31 seconds. That's how long my heart stopped. 31 seconds where everything went silent inside my body. 31 seconds where I technically wasn't here anymore. They brought me back. Barely. And they put me into a medically induced coma. 3 days. Machines breathing for me, monitors watching every function, doctors adjusting medications minute by minute. And through all of that, through all the alarms and interventions and critical care, the hospital called my emergency contact 23 times. No answer. When I woke up, the first thing I felt was weight. Not physical weight, not the tubes or the exhaustion or the heaviness in my limbs, but something deeper. Something emotional, something like grief without context, like my body knew something had broken even before my mind caught up. A nurse was sitting beside me. She smiled when my eyes opened. "Hey," she said softly, like she didn't want to startle me back into unconsciousness. "You're back." My throat hurt when I tried to speak. "How long?" I managed. "3 days." "My mom?" That pause told me everything. "We tried," she said gently. "Many times." I closed my eyes. Of course they did. Of course she didn't answer. At noon, a hospital administrator came into my room with paperwork. I expected numbers I couldn't afford. I expected stress. I expected another problem. Instead, she smiled. "Your balance is 0. I blinked. "What?" "Paid in full, yesterday." "By who?" She checked the file. "Anonymous donor. Anonymous." Just like that, someone I didn't know had stepped in where my own family hadn't, and that should have been the strangest part of my story, but it wasn't. Not even close. My mother came at 4:15 p.m., not rushing, not emotional, not relieved. She stood by the door like she was visiting someone she barely knew. "You're awake," she said. No hug. No touch. No, I was worried. "Just observation." "I almost died," I said. "But you didn't," she replied quickly, like that settled everything. Then she looked around the room at the machines, at the IVs, at the monitors. "You should ask them to discharge you soon. Hospitals overcharge for everything." And in that moment, lying in a bed I had nearly never left, something inside me shifted permanently. Because I realized this wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. This was just the first time I was seeing it clearly. And I had no idea yet that everything I thought I knew about my life, my childhood, my family, my past, was about to collapse completely. Because the person who paid my hospital bill wasn't random. He wasn't anonymous. And he had been watching my life for longer than I had been alive. The next morning, I was still trying to convince myself that everything that had happened was just a sequence of unfortunate events stitched together by exhaustion and bad timing. That my mother's reaction was just who she was, and not something I needed to analyze. That the anonymous payment was some kind of charity program I didn't understand. That I could go back to my life once I was discharged and pretend none of this had changed anything fundamental about me. But that illusion didn't last very long, because at exactly 10:18 a.m., while I was sitting upright in my hospital bed trying to drink water without my hands shaking, there was a soft knock on the door, and the nurse stepped in with a look I couldn't immediately read. Something careful and almost anticipatory. And she said, "Emily, you have a visitor. He says his name is Daniel Hayes. Do you want me to send him in?" And I remember freezing for a second, because the name meant absolutely nothing to me. I had never heard it before. Not in passing. Not in memory. Not in any story my family had ever told. And yet something in the way she said it made my chest tighten. Like my body recognized significance before my mind could. So I nodded slowly and said yes. And when the door opened, the man who walked in didn't look like someone who made mistakes or arrived by accident. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. Posture straight, movements controlled, the kind of presence that filled a room without needing to raise a voice. And he paused just inside the doorway like he was giving me time to adjust. Like he understood that his existence alone was about to disrupt something in my reality. And then he said my name in a way that felt both unfamiliar and deeply personal at the same time. "Emily." And I felt something twist in my chest because strangers don't say your name like that unless they've been carrying it for a long time. And he stepped closer slowly, deliberately, not wanting to overwhelm me. And he said, "My name is Daniel Hayes. I know this is unexpected, but I need you to understand that I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." And I remember gripping the edge of my blanket because the room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the air had shifted. And I asked the only question that made sense in that moment. "Who are you?" And he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, worn at the corners, the kind of wear that only comes from being carried northward. And he handed it to me carefully. And when I looked down at it, my entire body went cold because it was a picture I had never seen before, but somehow recognized instantly. A man holding a small child, smiling in a way that felt unguarded and real and alive. And the child was me, younger than any memory I had access to, maybe 2 or 3 years old. And the man holding me was my father. The father I had been told died when I was too young to remember anything meaningful. The father who existed in my life only as a vague concept and a handful of sanitized stories. And my hands started shaking as I looked up at Daniel, and he said quietly, "Your father and I served together." And just like that, the ground beneath everything I thought I knew shifted. Not cracked, not weakened, but shifted completely into something unfamiliar and unstable. Because my mother had always said no one from his past stayed in contact, that after he died, everything just ended, that there was nothing left to hold on to, nothing to revisit, nothing to question. And yet here was a man standing in front of me who clearly contradicted all of that simply by existing. And I felt my voice come out smaller than I expected when I said, "Why are you here?" And he didn't hesitate this time, his eyes steady on mine. "Because your father made me a promise. And I've spent the last 25 years making sure I didn't break it." And the words hit harder than I expected, because promises like that aren't casual, they aren't symbolic. They are anchored in something significant, something final, something said when there is no time left for anything unnecessary. And I felt a pressure building in my chest as I asked, "What kind of promise?" And he exhaled slowly, like he had carried this conversation in his mind for years, rehearsed it, refined it, waited for the right moment that never seemed to come until now. And then he said, "Your father knew he wasn't going to make it." And everything inside me stilled, because no one had ever said it like that before. Not directly, not without softening it, not without turning it into something abstract and distant. And Daniel continued, his voice low but steady. He had about 15 minutes after the explosion, just enough time to talk, and he didn't talk about the mission or the situation or anything like that. He talked about you. And my throat tightened immediately, because I didn't have memories of that kind of love. Not firsthand, not in a way I could recall. And he said he told me your favorite color, your favorite book, the way you used to follow him around the house pretending to be a medic. He said you were brave, that you didn't cry easily, that you always tried to help people, even when you didn't understand what was happening. And I felt tears building whether I wanted them or not, because this was a version of my father I had never been given, a real one, a human one, not the distant figure my mother had reduced him to over the years. And then Daniel said something that made my heart skip entirely. And then he said, "If I don't make it, promise me, you'll watch over her, because I don't trust what's going to happen after I'm gone." And I stared at him because that didn't fit, that didn't align with anything I had been told. And I whispered, "What do you mean?" And Daniel's expression shifted slightly, not softer, not harder, just more precise, like he was stepping into a part of the truth that required absolute clarity. "I mean, your father was worried about you, specifically about you, not just because he wouldn't be there, but because of what he believed might happen with your family." And I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because there are certain things you don't question until someone else does it for you. Certain dynamics you normalize because they are all you've ever known. And suddenly, those dynamics were being reframed in a way I wasn't prepared for. And before I could ask anything else, he reached into his jacket again and pulled out a thin folder, placing it gently on the table beside my bed, and said, "I didn't come here just to tell you stories, Emily. I came here because there are things you were never told, things that directly affect you. And after what happened this week, after the way your family responded, I don't think it's right to keep you in the dark any longer." And I remember feeling my pulse in my ears as I looked at that folder, because instinctively I knew it wasn't something small, it wasn't something casual, it was something that had been hidden, something that had weight. And I said, "What kind of things?" And Daniel met my gaze without hesitation and said, "Financial, legal, and personal, all connected to your father's death." And everything inside me went quiet, because I realized in that moment that the worst part of my story might not be what had happened to me physically, might not be the hemorrhage or the surgery or the 31 seconds my heart had stopped, but something much deeper, something that had been shaping my life for years without my knowledge. And as he opened the folder and turned it toward me, I understood that whatever came next was going to change everything, in a way I wouldn't be able to undo. Not even if I wanted to. I remember staring at the documents for a long time without actually reading them. Because sometimes your mind understands the weight of something before your eyes process the details. And I could feel it immediately. The heaviness of years, of decisions made without me, of truths that had been deliberately kept just out of reach. And when I finally forced myself to focus, to read the first page, then the second, then the third, it didn't happen all at once. It happened in fragments, in pieces that didn't seem to connect until they suddenly did. And when they did, it felt like the ground beneath my entire life collapsed into something I no longer recognized. Because what I was looking at wasn't just paperwork, it was proof. Proof that my father hadn't left me with nothing. Proof that there had been a fund, a protected account set up in my name, structured carefully, legally secured, untouchable, until I turned 25. Unless accessed for medical emergencies or education. Proof that there had been enough money to make sure I never struggled the way I had. Never worked double shifts just to cover rent. Never skipped meals during college. Never stood in that hospital terrified just of dying but of the bill that might follow. And yet none of it had ever reached me. None of it had ever been mentioned. And I could feel my hands going cold as I flipped to the next page and saw the transaction history, saw withdrawals, saw dates that lined up too perfectly with moments in my life when things had gone wrong, when my mother had said we couldn't afford something, when she had told me I needed to be stronger, more independent, less demanding. And then Daniel's voice cut through the silence in a way that was almost gentle, but carried no room for denial. Your mother gained temporary access to the account after your father's death as your legal guardian. And I didn't want to understand what that meant because I already did. I understood it too well. I understood it in the way my chest tightened and my breathing slowed, in the way my thoughts stopped trying to find alternative explanations. And I said it anyway, quietly, like maybe saying it softly would make it less real. She took it. And he didn't correct me, didn't soften it, didn't offer a different interpretation. He just said yes. And that single word did more damage than anything else could have, because it wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about financial betrayal. It was about every moment I had trusted her. Every time I had believed her when she said we were struggling. Every time I had blamed myself for needing too much, for being too much, for not being easier, quieter, less of a burden. And suddenly all of those memories rewrote themselves in real time. Not as moments of hardship, but as moments of manipulation, as carefully constructed narratives designed to keep me small, while she used what was never hers to begin with. And I felt something inside me shift again. Not break this time, but solidify into something sharp and unmovable. Because grief is one thing, but clarity is another. And clarity doesn't leave room for excuses. It doesn't allow you to hide behind confusion or doubt. It forces you to see things exactly as they are. And I looked up at Daniel and asked, the only question that mattered now, why didn't you tell me sooner? And he didn't look away, didn't hesitate. Because legally, I couldn't intervene until you turned 25 unless there was evidence of direct harm. And I monitored the account, I documented everything, I prepared for this moment, but I needed you to reach the point where the law would be on your side, not just the truth. And there was something both frustrating and deeply grounding in that answer, because it meant this wasn't negligence. It wasn't abandonment. It was patience, calculated and intentional. And I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that settle somewhere inside me. And then I asked, and now? And for the first time since he had walked into the room, there was something almost like finality in his expression. Like we had reached the point he had been waiting for all along. Now you decide what happens next. And it was strange how simple that sounded compared to how massive it actually was. Because what he was really saying was that everything had shifted. That the version of my life I had been living was built on something false, and I now had the power to rebuild it on something real. And that kind of freedom isn't light, it's heavy. It comes with responsibility, with consequences, with choices that can't be undone. And I sat there for a long moment letting that sink in before I said, I want everything documented. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every signature, I want it all. And he nodded once, like he had expected nothing less. Already done. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of a very long one that had started before I was old enough to understand it, and the beginning of something else entirely, something that would finally belong to me. And when my mother walked into the room later that afternoon, carrying the same detached expression, the same casual indifference, the same assumption that nothing had fundamentally changed, I didn't feel the need to argue or raise my voice or demand explanations. Because I didn't need anything from her anymore. Not answers. Not validation, not even acknowledgement. And when she said, "You look better, I told you it wasn't that serious," I simply looked at her and said, calmly, clearly, in a way that surprised even me, with how steady it sounded, "I know about the account." And I watched the shift happen in real time, subtle at first, then undeniable. The flicker of recognition, the tightening of her jaw, the brief calculation behind her eyes as she tried to assess how much I knew and what she could still control. And that was the moment everything between us ended. Not with shouting, not with drama, but with truth, clean and irreversible. And she started to speak, to explain, to justify, to reshape the narrative the way she always had. But I didn't let her. I didn't need to hear it. Because I had already lived the consequences of her choices. And I wasn't going to let her rewrite them now. And I said, "You don't get to explain this to me. You can explain it to a lawyer." And for the first time in my life, I saw something I had never seen in her before. Not anger, not disappointment, but uncertainty, real and unfiltered. Because control only works when the other person doesn't know they have a choice. And in that moment, she realized I did. And as she stood there trying to find a way back into a situation she no longer owned, I felt something unexpected settle over me. Not relief exactly, not happiness, but something quieter and more permanent, something like certainty. Like finally standing on solid ground after years of not realizing you were sinking. And later that night, after she had left, after the room had gone quiet again, after the machines settled into their steady rhythms, I looked out the window at the city lights and thought about everything that had happened. About the pain, the betrayal, the near death, the truth that had come too late, and yet exactly when it needed to. And I realized something that stayed with me long after I left that hospital. Something simple but unshakable. That the worst thing that had ever happened to me had also been the thing that forced the truth into the open. And without it, I might have lived my entire life inside a lie that I didn't even know existed. And as I closed my eyes that night, not as someone who had almost died, but as someone who had finally woken up, I understood that this wasn't the end of my story. It was the first time it actually belonged to me.